Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Gruneau.
Hi, and we're very pleased to have Scott Ritter today. Scott Ritter is a former Marine intelligence officer who implemented arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, played a chief role as the 1991 to 1998 chief weapons inspector for the United Nations in Iraq, and is welcome, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I've been seeing all this horrible news from Israel, and I know you've been extremely harsh about Israel, so maybe an outlier in terms of just how harsh you've been, but all the news has basically been saying, wow, Scott Ritter was right. So we wanted to have you on for that, but just in the last couple of days, we've had this major sort of escalation towards World War III, and I thought you might want to talk about that.
Well, you know, it's interesting you frame it like this because I did an event in September, on September 28th, together with Gerald Salante and others in Kingston, New York. And at that event, I kicked off what I called Operation Dawn, which was 4 questions that I posed to the American voter. What would you be willing to do to save democracy, to save America, to save the world through your vote in November? And I had articulated at that time that there was only one existential threat to the United States, and that was the danger of nuclear war, and that nothing else mattered. I received a lot of pushback from friends and colleagues and allies about Gaza, and they said, well, no, the genocide can't be ignored. And my God, my heart supports them like you wouldn't believe. I can't talk about the case of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl that was slaughtered by the Israelis on purpose, or mothers who walk their children across the clearance to be assassinated in front of their child, only have the child while staring down at the body of their dead mother, shot dead by the Israelis as well, or those who are sleeping in their homes in Gaza, only to have their homes leveled and crushed to death by the bombs dropped by Israel, American bombs dropped by American airplanes piloted by Israeli pilots, or the citizens of Beirut, southern Beirut, who thousands have died. I have friends in Beirut who contact me and talk about the absolute horror of the situation they face. My God, my heart goes out to these people like you wouldn't believe. I scream at the top of my voice about the crimes being perpetrated, the genocide, and the need for Israel to be held to account. But none of this matters if we're all dead. No matter what happens in Gaza, as bad as it is for the Palestinians, and I just told you that my heart bleeds for them, as bad as it is for the southern Lebanese, my heart bleeds for them. None of it matters if we are all dead. And that's what nuclear war will do. And I have tried to emphasize to the American public that the Biden administration is taking us down a path that inevitably leads to a nuclear war with Russia, which will kill us all. I ask people to read Annie Jacobson's book, Nuclear War. She runs through very realistic scenarios. They're realistic because she interviewed dozens of former officials who made nuclear policy, who manned the nuclear weapons, who understand the reality of nuclear war. And they painted a very realistic scenario about how such a war could start and what the consequences would be. 72 minutes after a nuclear war starts, all life as you know it is over. The war is over and we all die. 72 minutes. And people would roll their eyes and say, well, you're just being, you're hyperbole, you're panic mongering, you're fear mongering, you're doing whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Biden just triggered a nuclear war. He allowed Ukraine to fire missiles that can only be fired if America targets them and enables their use onto Russian soil. And the Russian government has said that this constitutes an act of war by the United States, that the United States has in effect declared war against Russia. And now we are waiting for the Russian response. We don't know what Russia is going to do, but Russia has said that it will respond decisively.
I remember when Putin made that statement, he was very much, I mean, the reporter asked him the question, what will Russia's response be if NATO allows Ukraine to use these weapons to long range to go into Russia? And he said, well, let me just reframe your question here, because I think you've gotten it wrong, because this isn't really a matter of them allowing Ukraine to do something, because our intelligence says Ukraine doesn't really have the capability to do this on their own. They wouldn't be just getting permission to do this. This would be NATO troops, officers doing these actions against Russia. So at that point, it would be NATO going to war against Russia, and at that point, Russia would respond.
Yeah, excuse me. You're 100% correct. The characterization is accurate, and it's been mirrored by every Russian official that has spoken on the subject. And we should also point that there was no. My dogs are likewise upset by the notion of nuclear war. Um,
They should be.
at no point was there any wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed, or otherwise hesitance on the part of either Vladimir Putin or anybody else in Russia about this topic. The Russians have been clear-eyed and clear-voiced about this, so there can be no room for misunderstanding. The issue here is that the United States and NATO believe Russia is bluffing, that Russia has no intention of backing up these very strong words of Vladimir Putin with military force, let alone nuclear force. Keir Starmer made that point today when asked. He calls the Russian words irresponsible, but he is under the impression that Russia is bluffing. NATO is under the impression that Russia is bluffing. France is under the impression that Russia is bluffing. The United States is under the impression Russia is bluffing, and now they've carried out an action which is, in the minds of the Russians, but also in reality, an act of war. The United States has, in effect, declared war on Russia because these missiles could not have been launched by Ukraine without the expressed, not just permission, but intervention, action. America loads the target data. America enables the communications with the American satellites that guides the missiles. America targeted them. America gave permission. America facilitated the attack. This is an American attack against Russian soil. And the Russians now will respond accordingly. I don't know what this will be. I know what some Russian politicians have suggested it will be, and it would be devastating for Ukraine. But they also have indicated that the people responsible will likewise. I saw an articulation by Russian military sources. They know exactly how this attack took place. They know what aircraft were used to gather the intelligence. They know where the intelligence was packaged. They know what satellite the communications was relayed down to. So what they're saying is, we know who to target. We know who is responsible. And these are American targets with American service members who will die if Russia does this. This is not a game anymore. This isn't a computer game. This isn't some sort of academic exercise. This is reality. And this reality could become very, very stark very, very soon.
I mean, in real life, you don't call a bluff if you've got a weak hand, and you don't call a bluff if you're, I mean, what are the stakes if we get this wrong and we don't call the bluff? I guess for the U.S., it's a major blow to the imperial ambitions and their, remaining a hegemon, but the consequences on the other side of getting it wrong are just so astonishing, just so out proportionate to anything else.
But we need to modify this somewhat. Um, the American people went to the polls on November 5th. And it doesn't matter where you stand on that issue. I don't care if you voted for Kamala Harris, if you voted for Donald Trump, if you voted for Jill Stein, if you wrote in Mickey Mouse. It doesn't matter. The majority of Americans, maybe not an absolute majority, but more Americans voted for Donald Trump than any other candidate. And he won a decisive victory. That is a statement by the American people that they support the platform of Donald Trump. And the platform of Donald Trump was no to war in Ukraine, no to escalation in Russia with Russia, no to nuclear war. So you can't make the claim that Joe Biden is trying to hold on to empire. The decision has been made by the American people that that's not the direction they want to go. So this makes the actions of the Biden administration all the more egregious because they are not only taking America down a path where we could very likely have a nuclear war, but they're doing it against the expressed will of the American people who said no to this. This is an absolute disregard for democracy. Yes, Joe Biden is president until January 20th, but that doesn't mean that he gets to disregard the will of the people. The people clearly rejected his vision of how we should proceed with Ukraine, and he must respect this part of the American people. He can continue, to maintain the present policy course, but this isn't maintenance. This is a radical redefinition of how America deals with the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, one which brings us dangerously close to the possibility, and I would even say probability of nuclear war.
Don't presidents usually, when they're handing over to another president, even before that happens, don't they consult with them or discuss matters with them? Or I would think that they would do that. Although I don't know, how much Biden is the one running things.
I'll give you an example. When the Bush administration was going to transfer power transition, to Barack Obama's team. One of the big issues out there was the New START treaty, arms control, and how to move forward. And the Bush administration had made a decision that it was not going to um, extend the New START treaty. But Barack Obama ran on a platform that said that they were. And so the Bush administration, instead of carrying out actions that would make negotiation more difficult, which they could easily have done, they consulted with Obama and they deferred. They punted. They said, look, you're going to be the president. We're not going to make this problem worse for you. We're going to leave it where it is. We're not going to do anything to, move forward. That's your job, but we're not going to make it worse for you because we respect the fact that you won an election and that the American people are supporting your policy prerogatives. This is what Biden should have done. It doesn't mean that he has to, shut down NATO and cut off all support to Ukraine. But what he needs to do is respect the fact that Donald Trump will be president, and Donald Trump has options that he wants to pursue. And if it's something that Biden can't support, then at a minimum, Biden just maintains the status quo, and then allows Trump to make the changes that he wants. He doesn't have to facilitate the Trump policy objectives, but he shouldn't be seeking to undermine them because he was voted out. There is not going to be a Harris administration to continue the work of the Biden administration. Donald Trump will be the president for the next 4 years, and he will make a decision on how we proceed regarding Ukraine, Russia, and war. And Biden should respect that. But this is absolute disrespect on the part of Joe Biden and his staff. They're trying to confront Donald Trump with a fait accompli. And that fait accompli revolves around the relationship between Ukraine and NATO. Ukraine wants to be a member of NATO. That's not going to happen before January 20th. But what can happen is that NATO becomes so intertwined with Ukraine that Ukraine becomes a de facto extension of NATO. And this is the direction that the Biden administration is heading. If Russia fails to respond to this use of American long-range missiles, the potential future use by Ukraine of British missiles and French missiles, the next thing, because remember, this is all linked to Zelensky's victory plan. And he has articulated what needs to happen. And what needs to happen is he has to have permission to use long-range weapons. The next thing that will happen is he will seek to have NATO air defense systems on NATO soil extend their protective umbrella into Ukrainian territory to shoot down Russian missiles operating in Ukraine. That will be followed by the NATO air forces flying into Ukraine to do the same thing, to engage Russian missiles the same way that the United States and others engaged Iranian missiles being fired against Israel. And then they will put boots on the ground. What happens is you have Ukraine and NATO being thoroughly intertwined so that you cannot distinguish between the two. And that's the reality that would be inherited by Donald Trump on January 20th. This is the goal and objective of NATO, of the European Union, of Ukraine, and the Biden administration. And it runs against the grain of everything that Donald Trump said he wants to achieve as president of the United States.
I mean, I think I'm going to agree with most of that. I think that Democrats really only have balls when they're doing something that's really close to their heart, and a lot of the stuff that they're doing is just for show. But they really, really like the Ukraine war. Biden has been, has said for decades now he's a foreign policy guy. That's where his heart really is in foreign policy, and he's been pushing this hard. And he's really is going to go to the wall to get what he wants and not let Trump decide. That said, I am skeptical of the idea that Trump is necessarily anything at all like a peace candidate on this. He's been submitting all of his potential cabinet people's names under the Presidential Transition Act of 1963 to get vetted for clearances. And some of the names of people he's put up, I mean, I forget which one it was, but they basically adopted the Zelensky plan. They said they're the only way they're going to get their peace that they want in Ukraine is to like gloves off and let Ukraine really go at Russia now. And it's they basically would have I think approved of exactly what's just happened. And I'm not sure I really know where Trump stands because Trump has a record of sort of being on all sides of all issues to get elected. And then when he gets in office, he's also very erratic and no one can kind of know quite where he's going with things.
Well, I'll push back on that because I think I do have a insight into where Trump stands on this. As part of Operation Dawn, I reached out to RFK Jr., who at that time had jumped the ship. He was now part of the Trump team. And I said, you really need to get Donald Trump to commit to a policy on Ukraine and on Russia and nuclear war. We need to know more about what he is going to do as president. And Donald Trump Jr. took what I wrote, took it to RFK Jr. took what I wrote, took it to Donald Trump Jr., and they turned it into an op-ed piece that was published on The Hill. It's the only articulation by a candidate for president of the United States of that scope and scale. Even Jill Stein never committed in writing to something of this nature. And it was dead set against an expansion of the conflict in Ukraine. The war had to end. It wasn't about unshackling Ukraine. It was about bringing the war to an end. And it said that the United States must normalize relations with Russia in order to prevent a nuclear war. This wouldn't have been written without the permission of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump did commit to this. And yes, he has put people around him who have said things. But we know, again, I'll just bring up the example of the last time Donald Trump was president, his effort to denuclearize North Korea. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was dead set against it. His National Security Advisor, John Bolton, was dead set against it. His Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, was dead set against it. His Secretary of Defense was dead set against it. His entire team was dead set against it, but it went forward. Why? Because Donald Trump doesn't care. Donald Trump is a top-down manager, and when he makes up his mind, when he believes that there's something he wants done, it's going to get done, or they will betray him. The lesson that Trump learned from this is not to surround himself with people who will betray him. Yes, the people that articulated these things firmly believe that, but these aren't Mike Pompeo's, these aren't John Bolton's. And when Donald Trump tells them, as he will do, that he wants to bring this war to an end, there will be zero pushback from them, because that's the way Donald Trump is operating nowadays. He does not tolerate betrayal. He does not tolerate dissent. And he has committed to a policy that brings an end to this conflict in Ukraine and normalizes relations with Russia to prevent a nuclear war. And I firmly believe that that's the direction he wants to go. You will not hear a peep from anybody in his team today. They may have said things before they got the nod. But since they've gotten the nod, you have not heard a peep from anybody about this was a good thing. Ukraine's unshackled. They get to do it, because that's not the policy that Donald Trump plans on implementing.
I would disagree with Gary on this a bit, but I see it in a slightly different light. And that is that, yes, he may be committed, but the Biden administration may just have done something very much like what the Eisenhower administration and Nixon did to Kennedy. Kennedy was interested in improving relations and had even spoken well of the Cuban Revolution when they were just coming into power and he was about to come into power. The Eisenhower administration started up the Bay of Pigs fiasco ahead of time, and so that when he came in, Kennedy sort of felt that he was kind of bound to it. I'm wondering if the Biden administration is trying to set things up so that the incoming Trump administration just has nowhere to go.
Well, that's exactly what they're trying to do. You know, there's another example of this. I'll just say it as when I was a weapons inspector, when the Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, lost the bid for election and Bill Clinton came in. I remember I was in Iraq meeting with senior Iraqi officials, and they were almost mocking me because for the previous year plus, I had been leading very aggressive inspections into Iraq, and I told them they had no choice but to comply because the Security Council had passed a Chapter 7 resolution, blah, 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 blah. And they finally, I come in and they go, "Your day is over, Mr. Ritter. It's finished for you. You see, Bill Clinton has won the election, and we have our people in Jordan meeting with his transition team. And when he becomes president, sanctions will be lifted. American oil companies are going to come into Iraq, and everything's going to be hunky-dory." And I was like, well, that's interesting. But what happened is the Bush administration found out about this. The day of Bill Clinton's inauguration, the United States was bombing Iraq to guarantee that Bill Clinton, when he became president, was a president who was de facto at war with Iraq. The same concept, to undermine, to prevent, meaningful challenge. I believe that this is what the Biden administration is out to do. They don't necessarily want a shooting war with Russia. They believe that Russia is bluffing, and they want to exploit this perceived Russian weakness to the full extent, so that when Donald Trump becomes president, he is confronted with a situation where NATO is embedded in Ukraine, that Ukraine is now thoroughly integrated with NATO. You can't separate the two. This gives NATO relevance, which means that Trump can't back away from NATO. He will now have to support NATO, and he will also have to continue to support Ukraine, which has become a de facto extension of NATO. this is what the Biden administration wants. This is what NATO wants. This is what the European Union wants. And they
Right.
are all conspiring to make this happen.
Right, and there have been stories for a couple months now about how the European Union was looking for ways to Trump-proof NATO and Trump-proof the war. And it's, I mean, while I'm not certain that I'm convinced that this is where Trump really stands or wants to go, I agree completely that everyone is, who wants this conflict to go on is at best uncertain about where Trump will go with it, and is afraid that he'll try to end the war. I mean, there were statements even before that op-ed. J.D. Vance said, "I don't care about Ukraine. This isn't our conflict. We shouldn't, be putting all our resources into that." And it was a very popular position to say, "Look, why are we spending, tens of billions of dollars, to ensure that this conflict keeps rolling on and Ukrainians keep going into the Russian meat grinder and we keep trying to, essentially weaken both countries?" That's not, what is that doing for us? We've got people on the streets. We could be, solving homelessness. We could be solving hunger. We could be solving American problems. We could just be putting this money into our economy more efficiently without going through the military industrial complex and without, just give it to people so that they can live their lives. Why are we, why is this our priority? Why is the Biden administration serving them over you, right? And so I mean, I believe that there's a big popular sentiment for this, and I believe that there's uncertainty about Trump at very best. But yeah, that's the only place I disagree is I see Trump, even with that op-ed, is still kind of an X factor. I really never kind of know exactly where Trump is going to go. But actually, if I can go back to this idea that we think Russia is bluffing. I mean, I think that's again. I think we've seen that line for a long, long time, and it doesn't seem to me that Russia has like internalized any like lesson in terms of how to make NATO or America understand that it's not bluffing. And I'm not sure exactly what I would tell Putin that he needs to do differently, right? I mean, I'm not maybe that smart, but what can we do to make the officials in Washington understand that it's not just a bluff?
Well, as long as Russia continues to articulate that if X is done, it changes the nature of the conflict, and then when X is done, the conflict doesn't change. I think in defense of Russia, they just simply look at the results. They point to the scoreboard. They're winning on the battlefield. They're demolishing the Ukrainians. They're winning globally, diplomatically. Russia's not isolated. They're winning economically. Russia hasn't paid a heavy price from the sanctions. Indeed, it's Europe that's paid the price economically. It's the United States has become isolated, and it's Ukraine that's losing on the battlefield. So in defense of Russia, there's no need to change direction, change what they're doing. What they're doing is winning. And indeed, even with these ATACMS missiles, of the six fired, Russia says they shot down five, and the sixth one was nipped and broke apart and did minor damage. But this isn't game changing. It isn't going to change the equation. The difference here, though, is the politics behind the intent of what's going on. Russia did draw a red line. They said this will be an attack by the United States against Russia, and this changes the qualitative nature of the conflict. And so now I believe people are waiting to see what Russia does. There's some talk, people talk about hybrid Russian response. Russia will arm the Houthi so the Houthi can fire more modern missiles against American shipping. They'll give the militias in Syria and Iraq better weapons so they can strike the American bases in Syria and Iraq. But this is all hybrid warfare, mumbo jumbo nonsense, the indirect approach and things of that nature. Russia needs to communicate directly, which means that there needs to be a meaningful response, one that leaves no doubt as to the seriousness of the situation, the way Russia treats this. And there have been Russian politicians who have articulated this. A senior senator who sits on the Defense Committee said that if this happens, that Ukraine will pay a horrific price, that the Ukrainian government will cease to exist, and that Ukraine itself will become ungovernable. And he has specified the weapon that would be used, what they call the father of all bombs, a giant thermobaric bomb that, if dropped, would literally do nuclear type damage to Kiev without using a nuclear weapon. This is horrible. I mean, we are talking about tens of thousands of people, maybe even more, depending on where you drop the bomb, dying. The damage will be unbelievable, and it would terminate the Ukrainian government. Is that the kind of signal that Russia needs to send? It was articulated by a Russian senator who advises Vladimir Putin. It doesn't mean that that's what Russia is going to do, but this is the danger of these academic type exercises where you have people like Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and others, playing, at geopolitics. If we do this, the Russians will do this. It's a giant, academic, debate. No, this is real. I don't know if people realize it, but hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have lost their lives. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have lost their lives. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. Their lives have been forever ruined. This is not an academic exercise. This is devastating to humanity. We talk about Gaza and the harm that's been done to the Palestinians in Gaza. That is a drop in the bucket to what Ukraine has paid. I'm not minimizing it. I'm just trying to say that we tend to ignore what has happened to Ukraine.
Right. I mean, just in terms of overall population, I mean, I think Gaza has the prospect of overtaking Ukraine because there's so many people in immediate jeopardy. But I'm glad we're coming back to the Middle East a little because it's the same thing that I'm seeing in the Middle East too. Lebanon is attacked and Hezbollah will say, or Iran is attacked and the Iranian government will say, we will strike back at a time and place of our choosing, and our retaliation will be wise and it will be intelligent and it will be felt. And it's very clear that these actors are very conscious of the risk of escalation, and they're very conscious of the dangers of going to an all-out regional war in the region. And Russia, likewise, when it has retaliated in ways that were effective and smart and at a time and place of their own choosing. But it seems like the U.S. government, when they're considering whether something is a bluff or not, don't understand intelligent responses. They only understand stupid, childish responses. And that's a conundrum for me because you want to have your position be understood and not be misviewed as a bluff. But how do you get through to an animal as dumb as the U.S. government? I mean, if it was your dog, you wouldn't respond to your dog, crapping in your bed with an intelligent, wise choice at the time and place of your own choosing. You would immediately rub the dog's nose in that before you spank the dog. And that's, I think, what needs to happen to the U.S. government to get them to understand, because they have less brains than your dogs. But I understand that is also a horrible, horrible thing and a bad road to go. So to me, it seems like this is a very difficult question.
Well, I'll make it easier. The consequence is thermonuclear war that terminates life on the planet as we know it. Now, when you put it in that perspective, I think now we can reverse it up and say, yeah, we really need a strong statement by Russia to prevent that outcome. Because that's what we're talking about here. We are talking about a situation that could easily spin out of control and end up in a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. This could happen very, very quickly, quicker than most Americans can even begin to comprehend. So when I put it in that perspective, I personally would encourage Russia to provide the strongest possible non-nuclear response, one where there is literally no doubt, one that actually pushes NATO and the United States over the threshold of war and call their bluff. Russia needs to basically say, you messed up. We told you there would be consequences. We told you that you would become a party to the conflict. You are now a party to the conflict. Do you want to expand this conflict? We have just signed a nuclear doctrine. Your next move may be your last. And that's literally where we are, because if Russia doesn't do this, then Joe Biden will slow roll this or fast roll this up through January 20th with continued escalations that will inevitably lead to nuclear war. We're going to get to a nuclear war if we let Joe Biden continue to do what he's doing. The only way to stop this nuclear war is for Russia to push back forcefully right now. It may be horrible, the consequences, but it pales in comparison to what the consequences of a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia would produce. And that's the direction we're heading. We are dangerously close to global annihilation through nuclear war. And Russia, I think, knows that. I think one of the reasons why we have hesitancy is that the Russians understand the consequences and they have to be prepared to follow through. But if Russia doesn't send a decisive signal to the Biden administration, to NATO, to Europe, and compel them to back down, for them to say, nope, we're done, we're not escalating, then they'll just perceive it as Russian weakness and they will continue to push.
The one aspect of that I think is important is if Russia takes something that to us looks like, or let's say to the United States and to what we're going to see in the mainstream media and to Europe and the quote unquote civilized world of Europe and 6 other countries. The rest of the world, the real world, the world with most of the power and most of the population and most of the economy, is going to be much smarter about this and understand it in much more the context that you're describing than in what we're going to see in the mass media. So, if Russia were to engage in some really terrible but forceful demonstration that it is serious, the reaction here in our media is going to be, this is horrible. Russia is escalating the conflict. Russia's committing these terrible war crimes. Putin should be banned from all civilized society. He needs to be in The Hague.
For them to pay for it. There'll be calls for a very harsh response from our side.
But I think the rest of the world will see it differently. They'll see it as like, yeah, well, they told you, right? And you kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So we kind of see Russia's side here.
One of the interesting things here is that if we go back again to September, when the United States was making noise that they were going to greenlight Ukraine's use of these weapons, Lloyd Austin went to Ramstein, Germany, where he participated in the Ukraine Contact Group, which is an ongoing meeting between Ukraine, the United States, and NATO to facilitate military support. And the Ukrainians went in there expecting that Lloyd Austin would give Zelensky permission to use these weapons. And instead, Lloyd Austin said these weapons won't change the outcome. They won't change anything. There's no reason for us to escalate in this manner. And Zelensky was devastated. And Lloyd Austin made it clear to the Biden White House that the Pentagon does not support this, that it would lead to escalations that would produce a conflict that the Pentagon is not prepared to fight at this time and doesn't believe that there was a need to fight it. Tony Blinken at the State Department took umbrage. He flew to Kiev together with his British counterpart, and their job was to give Ukraine permission. Zelensky fully expected a change in policy, but Lloyd Austin called the White House and said, stand them down. We will not support this. And so Blinken had to stand down, but then he coordinated with Keir Starmer to have Starmer fly to the White House where Biden was going to meet and sign off on the documents, and only the forceful intervention by the Russian government prevented this from happening. But my point is, the Pentagon is not behind this. The Pentagon is not pushing for this, and it's the Pentagon, not the State Department, that goes to war. So if the Russians respond decisively in a way that's not life-threatening to the United States, but puts the marker on the table that Russia's ready to go all the way, if that's the decision America wants, I believe that the Pentagon will be briefing the President of the United States that this is a war that will lead to nuclear consequences, and we can avoid this war by stopping right now the policy that we irresponsibly enacted. The Pentagon was against that. They articulated the dangers of this. Clearly, they lost that policy discussion, but the Pentagon's point of view will become very relevant if Russia responds, forcing Biden to make a decision between life and death, because that's what the next step would be. If the Russians do this right, there will be no doubt that further escalation by the West will lead to a nuclear war. And I actually believe that the American media will pick up on this nuance, and you'll see a little bit different articulation, because once it becomes clear that all life on the planet will end as we currently know it, it's amazing how clarity suddenly seeps into the minds of those who've been promoting bad policy.
Well, I think you're both right. I am a little less I'm a little more skeptical of the U.S. media. I think you're right. I think you're right that this narrative of, oh my God, it's serious. We're now the real brinksmanship is really here, and we haven't noticed it until now. But suddenly, it's like we really are at the threshold. I think that'll wake up a lot of people. I still think there will be calls. I think you've always seen this. There'll be a lot of pressure to counter-escalate by doing something even worse and putting us one step closer to nuclear war. And I think this will be a battle, just like it's been at every stage, where you've got, and the battle may continue on into the Trump administration, where you've got different people in Trump's ear, where some people saying we need a forceful response, we need to do this, and other people saying no, we're too close, we're going to kill everybody. And I think I just have a lot of doubt and a lot of uncertainty, and I think that there's a lot of room in there for people to see a place to like act on it, and say this is something that could go either way. I really need to make my voice heard against annihilating all life on Earth. And this will be a chance for people to, I mean, an unfortunate chance, but a chance for people to really make their voices heard. And they'll need to make their voices heard, I think. I don't think it'll be clear what the outcome will be without people's input.
I certainly hope that people have the opportunity to let their voices be heard. My concern is knowing a little bit about how these things work, that because nobody has compelled this kind of debate and discussion in the mainstream media, in the halls of power, that this will just sneak up on us. And by the time we become aware of the danger, it's too late. Nuclear war, like any other conflict, has a certain inevitability at some point in time as decisions are made, forces are moved, phone calls are made. And next thing you know, the thing that nobody wants is happening, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And
Apparently it goes too fast.
it goes way too fast. People need to understand the time pressure that leaders are on. And again, Annie Jacobson gives a brilliant scenario in her book where the President of the United States, together with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, on the phone with the head of Strategic Command, is still trying to figure out what's happening as a nuclear weapon is inbound to the United States. He's asking for more time, but he's being told there is no more time, Mr. President. If you don't give the order right now to launch, you will die before we can do anything. You alone can give this order, Mr. President. But he's calling around, are we sure this is this? And people are saying, Mr. President, you don't have time to ask that question. If you don't give the order now, you are going to die. You will die in 1 minute and 45 seconds. That warhead impacts. You're a dead man. You need to give the order. And he still doesn't believe it because nobody prepares for this.
Right. And you've made the point before that because we've disabled all of our arms treaties, the time to make that decision has gone down. And another point, I think that you've made this point as well, that, you know, in a state of heightened nuclear tension where we believe that the Russians might launch, right? And they believe that we might launch because we've moved up to DEFCON whatever, right? That is the condition where it is most likely that a Chinese weather balloon or toy balloon will float over the head and someone will go nuts because at that point, everything looks like a Russian missile or an American missile coming at you.
100%. Look, we have policies which are called launch on warning, launch on detect. It's not about waiting for a nuclear weapon to hit before your response. You launch when you believe a nuclear attack is underway. And the goal is to get your weapons out of the ground towards the enemy before their weapons hit you. And so if both sides now are leaning forward, believing the other is going to attack preemptively, therefore you need to be prepared to preempt their preemption, things that, for instance, just historically, we know that a flock of birds led Russians or Soviets to believe that they were under American ballistic missile attack in the 1980s, a flock of birds. We know that a Norwegian weather rocket led the Russians to believe in 1995 that they were under attack by Trident missiles. A lot of people don't know this story, that this Norwegian rocket was launched, the Russian radars detected it, interpreted it as an incoming Trident missile, which has very limited time. They brought the nuclear football to Boris Yeltsin, and they said, Mr. Yeltsin, you have to order our response right now. This is a Trident missile. It's on a reduced trajectory. It will come in with 18 warheads. It will decapitate us. And if you don't act now, then the Americans will come in and kill us all and we'll lose the war. You must launch now, must launch now. And Yeltsin, fortunately, said, no, I want to wait. And he waited beyond the window, meaning that he made a decision that he was going to die. But the phone call came in and said, no, it was a Norwegian rocket. That's how close we came to dying in 1995. And this is the point. When we have these tensions and we don't have these treaties, one of the beautiful things of these treaties isn't just that they limit nuclear weapons, but they increase confidence in between the two sides. First of all, we are working towards a common objective. The people that are planning nuclear wars are receiving Russian inspectors who are inspecting ours. We're going over there inspecting their weapons. We're talking with the weaponeers. We're talking at every level. We humanize this and we build trust and confidence and we reduce the fear and uncertainty, then allows us to do important things like take the missiles off of a permanent war footing. The other thing we did during the early days was to de-target the missiles. That is, that the missiles are in their silos, but no targets have been loaded. This buys us time because now to respond, you have to load the targets. That buys you more time to find out what's going on. But when you have your missiles on a hair trigger alert, targets already in, ready to go because you believe the next move from the Russians is going to be the launch, then a flock of birds becomes the threat, and you'll be told you have to make a decision to launch before you know whether that's a flock of birds or incoming Russian missiles. This is a very, very dangerous situation we're in because that's the posture of the United States today vis-a-vis Russia. We have front-loaded our system. We have missiles that are spun up with with the targets loaded in their guidance packages, ready to launch on a moment's notice. We have submarines out there, the same thing. The targets are in. They know what they want to do. And they're waiting to be told to launch. And they will be told to launch if we believe we've detected a Russian nuclear attack. And we are as susceptible as anybody to being spoofed. And then it's over. Once decisions have been made, you can't recall these systems. There is no fail-safe, and we all die. That's just the way it is. And this is why it's imperative that we do something to encourage dialogue. The fact that the Biden administration is not talking to the Putin team is disconcerting. They had an ambassador, Anatoly Antonov. He is an American expert. He was the last man to negotiate arms control treaty with the United States. He negotiated the New START treaty. He's an expert on arms control. He's an expert on Russian-U.S. relations, and he was the ambassador for 7 years, and we didn't talk to him. I met with him many times.
For 7 years? We didn't talk to him.
We didn't talk to him.
Wow.
He sat there, and we didn't talk to him. He had as his defense attaché a Russian major general who was a strategic missile forces commander. He was sent here to help the United States get a better understanding of the danger of nuclear war, to talk about the potential for a new treaty. We didn't talk to him. We didn't just not talk to him. We allowed the Ukrainians and NATO to isolate him. There's a defense attaché club. When you join, you go on the cocktail circuit. They took him off of it. They didn't allow anybody to interact with him or his men. And so at a time when it's absolutely imperative, because I remind people that the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved largely because we were talking to the Soviets directly and indirectly. We had official channels and we had back channels. Today, we are not talking to the Russians. Anatoly Antonov has left the United States. There is no Russian ambassador in the United States today. And we're getting ready to precipitate what could become a nuclear war. This is as dangerous as it gets.
And, you've heard all this rhetoric about, when Obama was coming into office, right? One of the things that, he said in the campaign trail, is that, he would be willing to talk to our opponents, right? And then Trump took office, and the line immediately became, oh, this horrible person, he talks to dictators. He's shakes their hands and is nice with them. And it's like, he loves dictators so much. It's like, it's actually kind of nice to have someone back who's willing to talk at least. I mean, I don't have much faith in any of them. I really hope that they're all a lot smarter than they look.
Well, I don't know about that. As optimistic as I try to be, I will say this, and the reason why I laugh is, first of all, no president is, a Russia expert. There are very few presidents are expert on anything. They're politicians who have spent their lives playing a con game based upon their own narcissism. They're surrounded by people that shake their head yes and say yes to everything. But they should surround themselves
in and out of politics. And putting it that way makes you really feel like Trump has been very qualified.
Well, he's as qualified as anybody that's ever been put up there because he's not qualified to do anything. And neither is anybody who's ran for president of the United States. Just to be honest, they are politicians who made so many compromises on their way up to be effectively neutered as true independent voices. I will say this, that Trump came up a different route. He hasn't always been a politician. He's been a businessman of some dubious pedigree, but it doesn't matter. He's different. But the point is, he's not a Russia expert. And now you have to surround yourself with people who are experts. And when it comes to Russia, the United States has not been in the business of producing genuine Russian experts for some time now. What we produce are what I call Putin whisperers, people who came into academic prowess by writing a PhD thesis on the dictatorial qualities of Vladimir Putin, how he's the worst man on the planet. And then they go and join, think tanks or the government where they're surrounded by like-minded thinkers. And so all you get is Vladimir Putin is evil, Russia is bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't have anybody who actually knows the truth about Russia. And we don't encourage people to go to Russia. I know this because I made 2 trips to Russia since May of 2023. And I was getting ready to make a 3rd trip. And the FBI came and took my passport and shut me down because the United States government is afraid of what I was doing in Russia, that I was going over and actually talking to the Russian people, talking to Russian leaders, and coming back and reporting the truth about Russia. This was unacceptable, so they shut it down. They don't want to have genuine Russian experts out there. And I'm fearful that no matter what happens with Donald Trump, he needs to get real Russian experts in there so that he can better understand what's going on inside Russia. He will meet with Vladimir Putin. There's no doubt in my mind. He will meet with him, and he's not going to do it the way Joe Biden did by calling him a stone cold killer, before the meeting, undermining any chance of success. Trump will meet, but the question is, will he understand what Vladimir Putin, what Sergei Lavrov, what other people are saying, or will he have his own prejudices that will prevail? He needs genuine Russian experts surrounding him, telling him, what is relevant, what is real, what is fake, because otherwise he'll be a prisoner to this community of pseudo Russian experts who are nothing more than Putin haters.
The some of these announcements regarding like the U.S. is going to authorize these type of long strikes, they talk specifically about the presence of North Korean troops, and it's like, well, it's like, is there a single nuclear power left in the world that isn't involved in this? I guess there's India, Pakistan, which is its own issue, but it's like, we're picking fights with nuclear powers, or helping. I mean, Israel is a mess, but that the nuke is on our side supposedly, but I don't trust that nuke either. So,
well, let's talk about North Korea for a second. There's no evidence that there's any North Korean troops in Russia. No evidence has been provided. We have people saying this. The United States government says this, but they haven't backed it up with anything. I've been to Russia. I know Russians, and I will tell you this: they are very contract oriented, very legally minded, and the idea that North Korea would dispatch 10,000 combat troops to Russia without any legal framework whatsoever is absurd in the extreme. But we know that Russia and North Korea were negotiating such a legal framework. Just last week, I believe that Russia ratified this framework that now said that if there is a conflict, that they have a strategic relationship and that either side can come to the other's assistance. Why would North Korea send 10,000 troops to go to Kursk and engage in combat when that final agreement hadn't been agreed to, ratified? There are no North Korean troops in Kursk. They can't be there.
You see all these pictures on Twitter of like Russians from the far east of the country, right? And people like labeling them, oh look, it's Chinese people. The Chinese army is there. It's like, no, you idiots! It's like those are Russians, right?
There's an interesting video on Twitter of Ukrainian troops surrendering to Asiatic-looking soldiers, and they're screaming, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! We don't speak Korean! We don't speak Korean!" And the soldier replies in perfect Russian, "I'm from Tuvan, you idiot! Speak Russian!" And you have entire brigades of Buryat troops who again are Asiatic. There are 3 million, I believe, Korean ethnic Koreans in Russia. There's a huge Korean community in Russia who get integrated, et cetera. That the idea that Korea sent 10,000 troops, first of all, militarily, it makes no sense. The Koreans, up until recently, have had no military to military training with their Russian counterparts. You can't take 10,000 North Koreans, put them on a battlefield, and have them integrate with the Russians with fire support, with command and control, with maneuver, with anything. Their tactics are different. Their operations are different. Everything's different. This is stupidity in the extreme. And yet it's been promulgated there.
I think we're projecting because that's like we put the Ukrainian troops through a 5-week NATO training regimen and send them back. So I think maybe we're just projecting our own stupidity onto them.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But the main reason for this is that Ukraine needs South Korea to provide it with arms and munitions, and South Korea has been hesitant. So the United States, together with NATO, has cooked up this fantasy of North Korean troops being dispatched in order to get South Korea to say, well, if North Korea is involved, then we will get involved. And this is just one giant psychological operation. I have seen no evidence whatsoever that there are North Korean troops operating on Russian soil, especially in Kursk in a forward area. And I would tell you that legally it's impossible for that to be until they sign that. But here's the ultimate irony. The United States just attacked Russia with 6 ATACM missiles fired by Ukraine. Russia has ratified this security agreement with North Korea. Russia is now under attack by the United States. And North Korea has every legal right and indeed duty and responsibility under this pact to come to Russia's assistance. So we just made it possible from North Korea to send troops to Russia. That's how stupid we are.
Um, Betsy had asked a little bit about the Middle East, though. So if we could maybe wrap up with a little discussion about, what's at stake there, and I mean, if you want to, because I recognize that the overarching issue is still going to be World War III, which I mean, our mutual friend Dan Kovalik tweeted this morning that it had just begun as of today.
Well, it has just begun today. I mean, it's this is World War III, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other conflicts. And world wars don't have to go nuclear. I do believe that left unchecked, if Russia fails to do something decisive to call NATO and America's bluff, that we are going to be looking at a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO in the not too distant future. And my fear is that once that happens, it will become nuclear. But there are other hotspots in the world. We have touched upon the Middle East. We're still waiting Iran's retaliation. I actually believe that Iran is holding off until the Trump administration comes in, out of the belief that Donald Trump was serious when he said that he is looking to lift sanctions against Iran, and he's not looking for regime change in Iran. And I think the Iranians are saying, okay, we're not in a rush. Our missiles can hit Israel at any time. Let's hold. Plus, the other thing the Iranians are saying, and this is a major aspect to what's going on right now, Israel is losing. Israel is losing across the entire spectrum of this conflict. Militarily, Israel is not winning in Gaza. Troops are terrified they have to go back into Gaza and fight for the same terrain they've already fought for 3 times, knowing that Israeli troops will die.
Everything's booby trapped. They're yeah.
Yeah, the desertion rate in certain units is between 12 and 24%. We're now getting more and more reports of Israeli soldiers, reservists, when they're called up committing suicide rather than going back. Against Hezbollah, the Israelis aren't having meaningful advances. That just today, the Golani Brigade suffered another crushing defeat on the battlefield. The Israelis have sent the 7th Armored Brigade in. It too will more than likely suffer crushing losses as it fails to accomplish its mission. They're going into terrain that Hezbollah has been prepared for 18 years, waiting for this opportunity. The Israelis aren't prevailing militarily. They're getting hit by Ansarallah. They have no response. And the Iranians have shown that they can penetrate the Israeli missile defense shield at will. So militarily, Israel's in a horrible position. Economically, they took a $67 billion hit last year. This isn't the cost of the war. This is money their economy's not making that they should have made. They're going to take a $100 billion hit this year. No tourism. Nobody's investing. It's an economic basket case, and it's only going to get worse. Politically, internally, Israel was in a near civil war status on October 6th. October 7th changed things as Israelis rallied behind the government, but now the government has been exposed as lying, cheating, stealing. Benjamin Netanyahu is under any number of ongoing investigations, including a renewed effort by Israeli courts to bring him on trial right now as he sits as prime minister for corruption charges. New charges are brought together for him lying to the Israeli people about October 7th. They're now talking about opening an October 7th investigation and also lying about the hostages. Let me put it this way. If we took Israel's problems and turned it into a briefing where we changed the word Israel to Iran, and I painted a picture of Iran with all of the problems I just said, American officials would be high-fiving each other saying, it's over. Iran is collapsing. It's in a state of free fall. It can't recover.
I mean, you've got this huge exodus from the country with all these people just leaving and fleeing. You've got Yoav Gallant audibly sniping against Netanyahu. They're in a big fight. You've got Smotrich saying, "Why is it all people from my party that are dying in the war? We need to put other people in the war. Let's get the religious people all and draft them and send them down." Everything is falling apart politically inside Israel.
And Israeli leaders, including former generals, etc., have said that Israel is fatally injured, that Israel will not recover from this. And I happen to agree. And so if I was advising the Iranian government, and I'm not, and I won't, but if they're listening, that's their issue.
The show has been listened to in Iran, by the way.
Well, there we go. You don't have to do anything. You have won. Israel is poisoned. Israel will die. The Israeli state cannot continue. You don't need to, escalate, etc. There's nothing Donald Trump can do to change this fact. The Trump administration is like a team of doctors arriving to a patient who has consumed a fatal amount of poison. You can make their passing easier, but you cannot save their lives. Israel has poisoned itself. The world has rejected Israel. The genocide that's taking place is recognized globally as a reality, and the Middle East has fundamentally changed. The Trump administration's greatest diplomatic achievement in the Middle East was the Abraham Accords. And one of the key factors of that was to get Saudi Arabia ready to recognize Israel, to work with Israel as part of this massive reimagination of the Middle East. That's over. Saudi Arabia has just met with Russia and said that Saudi Arabia will never recognize Israel, will never work with Israel until which time there is a Palestinian state and its capital is in Jerusalem. And that's something that the Likud government and the far right wing parties in Israel have said will never happen. And so Trump can't change this outcome. China brokered rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Trump will not reverse that. Saudi Arabia is actively working with Iran, cooperating militarily. Trump will not change that. This is a whole different world. So it doesn't matter how many Zionists Trump surrounds himself with. He's not going to be able to change the outcome. The fact is, Israel is on a path towards erasure. They will erase themselves. At some point in time, Israel will have to commit to a two-state solution. And when they do that, they will have to dismantle the West Bank settlements. And the second they try to do that, Israel will dissolve into civil war, and you will see a demographic shift as millions of Israelis flee the country. And when the demographics drop to a certain level, the viability of a Jewish state no longer is there. And now we have a one-state solution, and that state will be called Palestine. And that's the trajectory that we're on right now. So
Well,
That's a good look at it. What I feel is that Israel will realize what is happening to them, will try to stop it. They won't be able to stop it, and then will decide to take a whole lot of people with them.
yeah, you've got a country descending into chaos that has hundreds of nuclear weapons. So that's an X factor.
it is. But remember, South Africa, the apartheid state, created nuclear weapons to be used against black nationalists that were surrounding it. And they had the equivalent of the Samson option, meaning that they were going to take down all of black Africa if they were going down. But they collapsed from within. And the final thing that both the government did before they turned over was to turn their nuclear weapons over to the International Atomic Energy Agency and voluntarily be disarmed because they didn't want black nationalists to have nuclear weapons. I believe that Israel is going to collapse from within. They won't be able to cite the Samson option because the people killing Israel will be the Israelis themselves. And at some point in time, the Israeli people will say, we don't want the Palestinians to have access to our nuclear weapons and our nuclear technology. And when the writing is on the wall, I firmly believe that Israel will turn to the United States and the International Atomic Energy Agency and voluntarily get rid of their nuclear weapons. And that's the path that I believe is that we're headed on. And this path can happen if Iran doesn't attack Israel, if at the end of the day, people stop attacking Israel and just let Israel die.
Okay.
I can hope you're right.
All right. Well, we're definitely out of time, but I thank you so much for being with us. This has been absolutely great. I hope to have you back again soon.
Well, thanks for having me. As I said before, we live in a world of alternative media. And believe it or not, we have far more influence today collectively than the mainstream media does. The mainstream media, the legacy media is on the decline. I hope that this podcast, this discussion we just have, gets more hits than CNN has viewers, and there's a possibility to make that happen. So thank you for being part of this family of podcasts, this collaboration, and I would encourage your listeners to support you as much as possible so that you can keep doing the fantastic work that you do.
Well, thank you very much. Scott Ritter.